Hi there, I'm Riley Harris, and today we're going to be looking at pay discrimination under the Equal Pay Act, which will also be referred to moving forward as the EPA. This presentation is going to cover a little bit of the history, compliance, and enforcement of this federal law, and then as well as look at a couple real life violations and the results of those cases. And then also we are going to cover some recommendations for managers to aid them in being in compliance with the EPA in their daily work and their workplace. A couple quick housekeeping things. On the bottom left corner is the audio indicator. The audio will automatically play at the start of each slide. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. What is the Equal Pay Act? So, as stated in our textbook, this act mandates equal pay for work without regard to gender in the U.S. This was enacted in 1963. The main component that the Equal Pay Act is looking at is equal work. So if there is a discrepancy in pay, the main question is, are those individuals outputting equal work? Equal work is considered to be where those two individuals are producing equal output and work that is of sustainably equal value. So further, to look at the factors that we consider to determine equal work, you're looking at whether those individuals are required to have the equal, this, or rather the same skill, effort, and responsibility, and then also work that is completed under similar working conditions. It's also important to note that all forms of compensation are covered under the EPA. So that I'm not only talking about like salary or hourly wages, we're also looking at overtime, bonuses, holiday pay that comes in those different forms. And then lastly, I did want to note on the slide that employers are subject to compliance with this statute at the federal, state, and local levels. And we'll get a little bit more into that later in the presentation. When did the EPA come to fruition? So this federal law was enacted during President John F. Kennedy's administration. Two pioneers that heavily supported this law and were an integral part in its movement forward were Eleanor Roosevelt and Esther Peterson. I will note that this law was passed in 1963, but it did not become effective until 610 of 64. And it was passed as an amendment to the Fair Labor and Standards Act, which that act serves to regulate minimum wages, overtime, and child labor. Next, let's examine laws that complement the Equal Pay Act. So first, examining on the federal level. The first item I want to highlight is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This goes hand in hand with the EPA because it also prevents discrimination based on sex. However, the Equal Pay Act I can describe that as being more on a granular level, whereas Title VII of the Civil Rights Act protects against a broader scope of discrimination. However, it is very common if there is a Equal Pay Act violation that individual could also file a claim for a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So what I mean by that kind of broader scope is that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act states that no discrimination on the basis of color, race, religion, sex, or national origin. The other law that also goes hand in hand with the Equal Pay Act would be the Educational Amendment of 1972. So what this amendment did is it expanded the reach of the Equal Pay Act to include white-collar executive, professional, and administrative jobs. These categories were previously exempted under the original law, and that addition in 1972 just was able to broaden the scope entirely. Next, let's look at this on the state level. You will see that I included a quick visual aid that just kind of shows that trickle-down effect of the law going from the federal, state, and then to the local level. I just wanted you to keep that in mind as we look at these two Michigan supporting factors. So as a citizen of both state and country, we're held to both state and federal laws. So businesses must comply with their state-specific laws in addition to the Equal Pay Act. We cannot just look at it one way or the other. Two Michigan-based laws that show an example of this are the Michigan Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act. So that act prohibits discrimination in any employment based on the individual's race, age, color, religion, national origin, sex, height, or weight. Additionally, The Michigan Minimum Wage Law of 1964 sets the minimum wage for employers not covered in the FLSA. So it also requires that the payment of overtime for employees and prohibits discrimination based on sex. So as you can just see from this quick summary of these four different laws covered, two of which at the federal level and two of which as a Michigan specific example at the state level, the EPA works and complements itself with other legislation. So, what does enforcement of the Equal Pay Act look like? The agency that's charged with enforcing the EPA is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC. I'm going to talk a little bit about the claim process and then look at how the EEOC ensures compliance with this act. So, it typically begins where an individual files a claim. The claim must be filed within 2 years of the time in which the unequal act occurred. I did know here that there's a private lawsuit and an EEOC claim option. I wanted to make note of that because an individual can have a private lawsuit going on in tandem with the time that their EEOC claim is being investigated by the commissioners. So, just important to note there. After the claim is filed and accepted, meeting the parameters, then the authorized investigation process begins. This is where the commissioners are investigating, gathering data, inspecting records, and conducting interviews of people with the agency that's under suspicion of a violation. These commissioners are also granted the power to subpoena witnesses and order production of any documents or other evidence they may need to conduct this investigation. If there is enough evidence that's found through that investigation process, then the EEOC can file a lawsuit. Many times, though, before that lawsuit does occur, they will attempt to reach a resolution between a process called conciliation. This is where there's essentially an attempted resolution based on the complaint as an alternative dispute resolution prior to going to that litigation point. But if there's not a solution found in that space, then they would initiate and conduct litigation. The last step is the remedy. So, whenever the commission is investigating a charge or allegation where there is a possible violation, they will look to, in their remedy, charge that organization with now being compliant, and that can look through that can be executed through several different steps. We'll talk about some remedies later on some real cases. All right, now how does the EEOC ensure that organizations in the US are staying EPA compliant? So, the best way to stay EPA compliant is through acting in accordance with the requirements stated in this law. Now, refresh back to the background that we looked at. The law states that an organization may not pay unequal wages to any man or woman who perform a job that require the same skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. Now, what does that mean? So, when they're looking for a potential violation, the skills, what are the skills required for that job? Effort. Effort is defined as that physical ability to perform the job. Responsibility is looked at as the accountability that that job requires. And then working conditions is assessing both the physical and potentially hazardous working conditions. So that's kind of what compliance looks like. How they are executing and ensuring that compliance is by monitoring federal employment programs. They provide several outreach and education plugs to kind of redose organizations on what the requirements are. Annually, there's a EEO report, Equal Employment Opportunity Report. So that report occurs when an organization has 100 or more employees. They have to file this on an annual basis, and it essentially just provides some light on the demographics and pay information of the organization. Additionally, as described on the prior slide, there is a claim investigation process. So the EEOC does not take lightly claims of violations of the Equal Pay Act. And as you saw, they have a very detailed process for which they will investigate, pursue those claims, and provide a remedy as applicable. Next, we're going to examine an example where the Equal Pay Act was violated by a major tech company that we all know, Dell. So this occurred in 2020. There was an employee named Kia Golden with 24 years of work experience in tech who was found to be paid $17,510 less annually than her male counterpart. They worked within the same position and were hired through an acquisition at the same exact time. So we do have the grounds of equal work established. The EEOC took Kia's claim, investigated, and did find that there was a violation of the Equal Pay Act. So they first attempted to reach a resolution through the alternative resolution process of conciliation that I mentioned earlier. The conciliation process was not successful, and the EEOC did file suit against Dell. What they were seeking through their lawsuit was back pay, compensatory, and punitive damages. The punitive damages included barring Dell from engaging in discriminatory treatment in the future. With this lawsuit teed up, they proceeded to go through the litigation, however, ultimately agreed to settle the case. Employee Kia Golden did receive $75,000 in monetary relief, and Dell also had to agree to several provisions as the outcome of this settlement. These provisions included Dell requiring to engage in specialized training of the Equal Pay Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. They also were required to post a notice of employee rights for those two laws, and they also were required to report information regarding employee reports of discrimination to the EEOC for 2 years following that settlement. This is a great example of how we can examine the Equal Pay Act in action and the type of remedies that the EEOC will seek if a organization is found to be in violation of it. Next, let's examine a more local example. So let's look at a Michigan-based case in which Covenant Medical Center, located in Saginaw, Michigan, was found to be violating the Equal Pay Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So, as I mentioned earlier, those laws will commonly found to be going hand in hand for a violation because they do complement each other. What was found is that in the EEOC lawsuit, Covenant Healthcare violated the law by paying a female business intelligence developer a lower salary than two males who held the same job and performed the same work. So once again, we're going to see that theme where there is a burden to establish that yes, the same work is being performed, and that's measured by looking at those four factors of what kind of skills, effort, responsibility, and working conditions do these two people share. So, with this case specifically, there was first an attempt to reach a pre litigation settlement through the conciliation process again. So, the EEOC will opt for that as a alternative to the lengthy litigation process. The conciliation was once again unsuccessful, as what occurred in our last example. So, the EEOC did file suit in March of 2020. The parties did resolve the lawsuit by entering in a 2-year consent decree. There was monetary relief as well as the decree that required Covenant Healthcare to increase the female employee's salary and revise their compensation policies to ensure that those policies are in compliance with the Equal Pay Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. There was also a burden for Covenant Healthcare to now be required to train managers on compensation discrimination so that situations like this could be avoided in the future. This is another example of a violation of the EPA. It shows the importance for employers to build in maintenance processes for them to review their compensation packages and policies to ensure that they are up to date and not in violation of either of these laws mentioned in this case. Next, let's talk about how you as a manager can be EPA compliant. So the first step in doing so is knowing the law. If you have a great foundational understanding of what the Equal Pay Act requires, you have an opportunity to build that uh, boundary into your policies, procedures, and compensation structure for your direct reports or your organization as a whole. Additionally, there is the opportunity to file equal employment opportunity reports on an annual basis. Once again, these are required for organizations that have 100 or more employees, but it essentially serves as an annual checkpoint for that organization to compile their information and submit kind of by showing their hands, their round of cards to the EEOC of, hey, here's our demographics, our pay structure, and here's how our resources are allocated at our organization. Next, a way for managers to stay EPA compliant is by following a systematic approach for wage increases. So, what I mean by that is if you, as a manager or within your organization, have a defined evaluation system that's outlined, that is going to set you up for success with EPA compliance because if you are able to have documentation of what a wage increase was, why that individual received it, and what performance measures they either overexceeded or met to earn such an increase, we'll have a narrative around why that pay discrepancy exists or that pay differential exists. And then lastly, there's a suggestion to have a defined organizational structure within your department or organization because when you have a seniority system that is clearly outlined and defined, internally employees will see that structure and even externally. But then you have already defined those different tiers of seniority within your organization that also may be associated with differentials in pay. So these are just some ways that a manager can ensure that they're EPA compliant and also build a foundation and culture of which there's a process surrounding compensation structure within that organization. Thank you for viewing this presentation. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about the Equal Pay Act and how you, as a future manager, will use this information. Enclosed on the next slide, you'll find all the sources for this presentation. Thank you.